The intergalactic bar and grill was a dive like any other in this seedy part of the Orion Arm. Neon signs flickered, promising cheap booze and easy companionship to weary spaces looking to forget their troubles for a night. Inside, the air hung thick with smoke, sweat, and a dozen alien pheromones that would make a Venusian skunk retch. But to Sergeant Jake Mad Dog McGraw, recently retired from the Terran Defense Forces, it smelled like home sweet home. Jake slouched on a bar stool, his muscular bulk straining the seams of his faded uniform. He raised a glass of rot-gut whiskey to his lips, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat, just what the doctor ordered after another pointless day in his pointless civilian life. "Hey, barkeep, hit me again," Jake growled, slamming the empty glass on the sticky countertop. "And make it a double. It's been a hell of a day." The tentacled alien behind the bar, Arilo, gurgled something that might have been acknowledgement and began pouring another drink with surprising dexterity for a creature with no opposable thumbs. Jake watched the amber liquid splash into his glass and felt the old, familiar ache settle in his chest. God damn, he missed the action, the adrenaline rush of combat, the camaraderie of his squad, the sense of purpose that came from defending humanity against the hostile races of the galaxy. But those days were gone, and all he had left were his memories and regrets. Jake's eyes drifted to the hollow photo he always carried, currently propped up against an empty beer stein. The image showed two young men in battle armor, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning like idiots. Jake and his best friend, Zoltan. Good old Zoltan, the finest soldier Jake had ever served with, and a truer friend than any human. They'd been through hell together, from the siege of Betelgeuse to the Skoroyan meat grinder, saving each other's lives more times than Jake could count. But in the end, not even Mad Dog McGraw could save Zoltan from the enemy that finally claimed him. The Big C Zoltan species was particularly susceptible to cancers, and by the time they caught it, it was too late. He'd wasted away to nothing in a matter of months, leaving Jake alone in a galaxy that felt colder and emptier than ever. Jake tossed back his drink and signaled for another. Damn Zoltan for dying. Damn the doctors for not saving him. Damn the universe for being so cruel. But most of all, damn himself for still being alive when better men were dead. The reload placed another whiskey in front of him, and Jake reached for it eagerly. But before the glass could reach his lips, a firm hand clamped down on his wrist. "I think you've had enough, Sergeant McGraw," a stern voice said. "Drowning your sorrows won't bring Zoltan back." Jake looked up blurrily and found himself staring into the steel-gray eyes of a Terran in an expensive business suit. The man was of medium height and build, with nondescript features, the kind of face you'd forget as soon as you looked away. But something about his bearing screamed a government spook to Jake's experienced eye. "Who the hell are you?" Jake demanded, trying to jerk his arm free, but the man's grip was like a vice. "Ezekiel Kane, attorney at law," the man replied, flashing a humorless smile. "I represent your late friend Zoltan's estate, and I'm afraid I have some rather pressing business to discuss with you, Sergeant McGraw. If you'll come with me, please." Jake stared at him, uncomprehending. Zoltan's estate? What the hell did that have to do with him? But before he could protest, Ezekiel Kane was steering him firmly towards the exit, one hand still clamped on his arm. As they stepped out into the neon-washed night, Jake had a sinking feeling that his life was about to get a whole lot more complicated, and for once, The rot-gut whiskey churning in his gut had nothing to do with it. The hover limo glided through the night, its sleek black exterior reflecting the garish lights of the red light district. Inside, Jake slouched in the plush leather seat, nursing a hangover and a sense of unease. Across from him, Ezekiel Kane sat ramrod straight, his hands folded primly in his lap. The attorney had barely said a word since bundling Jake into the limo, and his silence was starting to grate on Jake's nerves. "All right, spill it," Jake growled, breaking the tense silence. "What's this all about? What does Zoltan's estate have to do with me?" Kane favored him with another of those humorless smiles. "Patience, Sergeant McGraw. All will be revealed in due time." Jake scowled, but bit back the retort that sprang to his lips. He had a feeling that pissing off this guy would be a bad idea. The limo banked smoothly, leaving the seedier parts of the town behind. They were heading uptown now, towards the glittering towers of the financial district. Jake watched the cityscape rush by, a sense of unreality washing over him. What the hell was he doing here, in this fancy-ass car, with this fancy-ass lawyer? He was just a grunt, a retired soldier with no prospects and no future. He didn't belong in this world of wealth and power. At last, the limo slowed to a stop in front of a towering skyscraper that seemed to be made entirely of glass and chrome. The headquarters of Kane, Kane & Kane, attorneys at law, according to the discreet gold lettering above the entrance. "We've arrived," Kane announced unnecessarily as a livery doorman hurried to open the limo door. Jake climbed out, feeling shabby and out of place in his rumpled uniform. He followed Kane into the building's opulent lobby, trying not to gawk at the soaring ceilings and gleaming marble floors. They took a private elevator to the penthouse level, where Kane ushered him into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. The room was tastefully furnished in leather and dark wood, with shelves of real paper books lining the walls. Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd seen so many dead trees in one place. "Please, have a seat," Kane said, gesturing to a plush armchair in front of his desk. "Can I offer you a drink? Coffee, perhaps?" "I'll take a whiskey, if you've got it," Jake said, just to be contrary. To his surprise, Kane merely nodded and moved to a well-stocked bar in the corner. He poured 2 generous measures of amber liquid into cut crystal tumblers and handed one to Jake before taking a seat behind the desk. "To Zoltan," Kane said, raising his glass in a toast. "A true friend and a hero to the end." Jake swallowed hard and tossed back his drink, feeling the burn of the expensive liquor. "To Zoltan," he echoed hoarsely. Kane set his own glass aside and steepled his fingers, fixing Jake with a penetrating stare. "Sergeant McGraw, I'll get straight to the point. Zoltan left the bulk of his considerable estate to you in his will." Jake's gut clenched at the thought. He might be a miserable bastard, but he wasn't heartless. He couldn't let some poor alien woman suffer because of his own selfishness. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll take the damn money and the wife, but don't expect me to be happy about it." Kane's smile was thin and sharp as a razor. "I wouldn't dream of it, Sergeant McGraw. Now, if you'll just sign here." He pushed a stack of papers across the desk, and Jake reached for the pen with a sense of grim resignation. It seemed his pointless civilian life was about to get a whole lot more interesting, whether he liked it or not. The Voltarian widow was named Solana, and she was quite possibly the most beautiful creature Jake had ever laid eyes on. She stood in the middle of Zoltan's opulent living room, her slender form draped in shimmering silver fabric that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her skin was a pale lavender, her hair a cascade of iridescent black that fell to her waist, and her eyes were large and almond-shaped, a striking amber color that seemed to glow from within. But it was the sadness in those eyes that struck Jake like a physical blow. Zalana might be breathtakingly lovely, but she was also clearly grieving the loss of her husband. "Sergeant McGraw," she said, her voice low and musical. "I am honored to make your acquaintance." She bowed her head, and Jake found himself at a loss for words. What the hell was he supposed to say to this woman? "Sorry your husband croaked, but hey, I guess you're stuck with me now?" Likewise," he mumbled, feeling like an idiot. "And please, call me Jake." Zalana inclined her head again, but said nothing. An awkward silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Jake cleared his throat, casting about for something to say. "So, this is a nice place Zoltan had here?" It was an understatement. The penthouse apartment was a palace, all gleaming marble and priceless art, and furniture that probably cost more than Jake had made in his entire military career. He felt like a bull in a china shop, afraid to touch anything lest he break it. Zoltan had exquisite taste, Zalana agreed, her gaze distant. He filled our home with beauty, just as he filled my life with joy. Her voice caught on the last word, and Jake saw her lower lip tremble before she pressed her fingers to her mouth, fighting for composure. Ah, hell. Jake might be emotionally stunted, but even he could see the woman was hurting. Before he could think better of it, he crossed the room and laid a tentative hand on her shoulder. "Hey, it's okay," he said gruffly. "I know you miss him. I miss him too." Zalana looked up at him, her amber eyes swimming with tears. "Do you?" she whispered. "Do you truly?" Jake swallowed hard. "Yay," he said thickly. "Zoltan was the best damn friend I ever had. Losing him is like losing a part of myself." A single tear slipped down Zalana's cheek, and without thinking, Jake reached up to brush it away with his thumb. Her skin was impossibly soft and smooth beneath his battle-roughened fingers. For a long moment, they stared at each other, caught in a strange, charged moment that Jake couldn't begin to understand. Then Zalana stepped back, breaking the spell. "Forgive me," she said, her voice once again composed. "I did not mean to burden you with my grief, Sergeant McGraw. You have already done more than enough by agreeing to honor Zoltan's final wishes." Jake shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm not doing it for him," he said bluntly. "I'm doing it for you. No offense, but I don't want his money or his fancy digs. I just didn't want to see you get screwed over by your own government." Zalana's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with something like gratitude. "You are a good man, Jake McGraw," she said softly. "Zoltan chose his heir well." Jake snorted. "I'm no heir," he said roughly, "and I'm sure as hell not a good man. But I'll do right by you, Zalana. I promise you that." She smiled, a small sad curve of her lips that nonetheless lit up her whole face. "I believe you," she said simply, "and I am grateful." She turned away, moving to gaze out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering cityscape below. Jake watched her, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. What the hell had he gotten himself into? And how was he supposed to navigate this new reality without screwing everything up even worse than he already had. But one thing was for damn sure. He wasn't going to let Zalana down, not after everything she'd been through. He owed Zoltan that much, at least. With a sigh, Jake turned to pour himself another drink from Zoltan's well-stocked bar. It was going to be a long night. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork and cultural misunderstandings. Jake found himself thrust into a world of wealth and privilege he'd never imagined, let alone experienced. Zoltan's estate was vast, encompassing not just the penthouse apartment, but also a sprawling country manor, a fleet of luxury vehicles, and a dizzying array of investments and business interests. Jake's head spun as he tried to make sense of it all, relying heavily on the army of lawyers and financial advisors Zoltan had left behind. But even as he struggled to adjust to his new reality, he couldn't help but be drawn to Zalana. The Voltarian widow was a constant presence in his life now, overseeing the household staff and managing the day-to-day affairs of the estate with a quiet grace and efficiency that left Jake in awe. She was also a mystery, her exotic beauty and regal bearing belying a deep well of sorrow that Jake longed to understand. But every time he tried to get closer to her, Zalana seemed to retreat behind a wall of polite formality. It was maddening and more than a little frustrating. Jake wasn't used to being shut out, especially by a woman he found so compelling. Matters came to a head one evening when Jake stumbled home late from a night of drinking with some of his old squad mates. He'd needed the release, needed to feel like his old self again after weeks of playing the part of the wealthy heir. But as he staggered into the penthouse, he found Zalana waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed and her amber eyes flashing with anger. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her usually melodic voice sharp with displeasure. Jake blinked at her, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process her words. "Out," he said stupidly. "With some friends." Zalana's nostrils flared. "And you did not think to inform me of your plans, to leave some means of contacting you in case of emergency?" Jake bristled at her tone. "I didn't realize I needed your permission to go out," he snapped. "Last I checked, I was a grown-ass man." "You are also the head of this household now," Zalana retorted. "You have responsibilities, Jake. Obligations. You cannot simply disappear into the night without a word." "Obligations?" Jake laughed bitterly. "What obligations? To sit around this goddamn mausoleum pretending to be something I'm not, to play nice with a bunch of rich assholes who wouldn't piss on me if I was on fire." He took a step towards her, his eyes narrowing. "You want to talk about obligations, Zalana? How about your obligation to me as my wife? Because so far, you've been about as warm and welcoming as an ice cube." Zalana recoiled as if he'd slapped her. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fury and something else, something that might have been fear. "I am not some chattel to be bought and sold, Jake McGraw. I am a person with feelings and desires of my own." Jake's anger drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving him feeling ashamed and more than a little disgusted with himself. "Zalana, I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean it like that. I don't know how to do this. Any of it." Zalana's expression softened, the anger in her eyes giving way to something like understanding. "I know," she said quietly. "And I am sorry too, Jake. I have not been fair to you. This situation is difficult for both of us." She took a step towards him, her hand coming up to rest tentatively on his chest. "But we are in this together, whether we like it or not. We must find a way to make it work." Jake swallowed hard, his heart pounding at her touch. "And how do we do that?" he asked hoarsely. Solana looked up at him, her amber eyes dark and unreadable. "We start by being honest with each other," she said softly. "By trusting each other, and by accepting that, whatever this is between us, it is real, and it matters." Jake stared down at her, his breath coming faster. "Solana," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. But before he could say more, a sudden explosion rocked the building, shattering the windows and sending them both flying. Jake hit the ground hard, his combat instincts kicking in as he rolled to his feet, searching for the source of the attack. Through the smoke and debris, he saw a group of heavily armed figures rappelling into the penthouse, their faces obscured by tactical helmets. And in that moment, Jake knew with a sinking certainty that his past had finally caught up with him, and that Solana was about to be caught in the crossfire. Jake reacted on pure instinct, his body moving before his mind had fully processed the threat. He lunged for Solana, tackling her to the ground, just as a hail of blaster fire ripped through the space where she'd been standing. "Stay down," he growled, covering her body with his own. As he reached for the pulse pistol he kept strapped to his ankle. Solana, to her credit, didn't scream or panic. She simply nodded, her eyes wide but determined, as she pressed herself flat against the marble floor. Jake popped up from behind the shattered remains of the coffee table, squeezing off a few shots at the nearest attacker. The man went down with a cry, his armor no match for the high-powered rounds. But there were more of them, pouring into the penthouse like a swarm of angry hornets. Jake cursed under his breath, knowing he was outgunned and outmanned. He needed to get Solana to safety, but how? His eyes fell on the door to the private elevator just a few feet away. If he could get them inside, they could escape to the garage level and take one of Zoltan's armored hovercars. "Solana, when I say go, run for the elevator," he said urgently, pressing the pistol into her hand. "I'll cover you." She nodded, her fingers curling around the weapon with a surety that surprised him. Maybe there was more to the Voltarian widow than met the eye. Jake took a deep breath, then burst from cover, firing wildly at the attackers as he charged towards them. They scattered, caught off guard by his sudden aggression, and Jake used their momentary confusion to his advantage. "Go! Go! Go!" he yelled, and Solana was moving, sprinting for the elevator with a grace and speed that seemed impossible in her flowing gown. Jake laid down, suppressing fire, dropping two more attackers before a searing pain ripped through his shoulder. He stumbled, his vision going gray at the edges as he felt the warm gush of blood down his arm. But he couldn't stop. Not now. With a roar of pure adrenaline, he surged forward, barreling into the remaining attackers like a human battering ram. They went down in a tangle of limbs and weapons, and Jake felt a savage satisfaction as he heard the crunch of breaking bones. He staggered into the elevator just as the doors were closing, collapsing against the wall as Solana punched the button for the garage level. She turned to him, her eyes widening in alarm as she saw the blood soaking his shirt. "Jake, you're hurt," she said, her voice tight with worry. He waved her off, gritting his teeth against the pain. "It's nothing," he lied. "We need to get out of here fast. They'll have backup on the way." Solana looked like she wanted to argue, but the elevator dinged, the doors opening onto the cavernous expanse of the garage. Jake pushed himself upright, scanning the rows of gleaming vehicles for the one he wanted. There, the matte black hovercar, all sleek lines and reinforced armor. Zoltan's pride and joy, a fortress on wheels. "Get in," he said, stumbling towards the driver's side. "We need to put some distance between us and this place." Solana slid into the passenger seat, her face pale but composed. Jake hauled himself behind the wheel, his vision swimming as he fumbled with the ignition. The car roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator, sending them hurtling towards the exit ramp. They burst out onto the street in a screech of tires and a blur of neon, weaving through the late-night traffic like a bat out of hell. Jake's shoulder was a white-hot agony, and he could feel his grip on consciousness slipping. "Jake, you need medical attention," Solana said urgently, her hand on his arm. "Let me drive." He shook his head stubbornly, blinking sweat from his eyes. "Can't stop," he mumbled. "Not safe." But even as he said it, he felt the world tilt and spin around him, the blood loss and adrenaline crash hitting him like a freight train. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Zolana's face, her amber eyes filled with a fierce, determined light. Then he was falling into the black, and he knew no more. Jake awoke to the sound of gentle humming and the soft brush of fingers against his skin. He blinked, wincing at the bright light that seemed to pierce straight through his skull. Where was he? What had happened? Then it all came rushing back. The attack on the penthouse, the desperate escape, the searing pain in his shoulder. He bolted upright, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over him. "Easy, Jake," a familiar voice said, and he turned to see Zolana sitting beside him, a damp cloth in her hand. "You're safe now." He looked around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. They were in some kind of underground bunker, the walls lined with weapons and supplies. A makeshift medical bay had been set up in one corner, and he realized with a start that he was lying on a cot, his shoulder swathed in clean white bandages. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. "A safe house," Solana replied, pressing a cup of water into his hand. "One of Zoltan's. He set it up years ago in case of emergency." Jake drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "How long was I out?" 2 days, Zolana said softly. "You lost a lot of blood, Jake. I wasn't sure if you were going to make it." He stared at her, suddenly realizing the implications of what she'd said. "You saved my life," he said slowly. "You got us out of there. Found this place. Patched me up." She ducked her head, a faint flush coloring her lavender skin. "I did what I had to do," she said simply. "What any good wife would do." Jake felt a sudden rush of emotion, a swelling in his chest that had nothing to do with his injury. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Zolana," he said thickly, I don't know what to say. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." She looked up at him, her amber eyes soft and warm. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. "Just rest and heal. We have much to discuss, but it can wait until you're stronger." Jake wanted to argue, to demand answers about the attack and the current situation, but the gentle pressure of her hand on his was too comforting to resist, and he felt his eyelids growing heavy once more. As he drifted off to sleep, he heard Zolana's voice, low and sweet, singing a Voltairean lullaby that seemed to wrap around him like a warm embrace. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake felt a sense of peace, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. When he awoke again, hours or days later, Solana was gone. In her place was a small handheld device with a blinking message light. Jake picked it up, frowning as he read the words on the screen. "Jake, my love," it began, and his heart stuttered in his chest. "If you're reading this, then I am already gone. I'm sorry for leaving without saying goodbye, but I couldn't risk putting you in any more danger. The truth is, the attack on the penthouse was no random act of violence. It was a targeted assassination attempt orchestrated by the same people who killed Zoltan. And now that they know about you, about us, they won't stop until we're both dead. I can't let that happen, Jake. I won't let you pay the price for my family's sins. So I'm going to finish what Zoltan started and end this once and for all. I only hope that someday you can forgive me. Remember, no matter what happens, I will always love you. Always yours, Solana." Jake stared at the words until they blurred before his eyes, a cold, hollow feeling settling in the pit of his stomach. She was gone, off to face their enemies alone, and he was stuck here, wounded and helpless, but not for long. With a grunt of pain, he levered himself off the cot, his jaw set with grim determination. He would find her, no matter what it took. He would fight by her side, and together they would make the bastards who had torn their lives apart pay. It was time for Sergeant Jake Mad Dog McGraw to live up to his name once more, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. Jake moved through the safe house like a man possessed, his mind racing as he gathered supplies and weapons. He knew he was in no condition to go charging off into battle, but the thought of Solana facing their enemies alone was enough to drive him forward. Pain be damned. He paused in front of a mirror, hardly recognizing the man staring back at him. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes haunted by shadows that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. But there was a fire burning in those eyes now, a fierce determination that had been forged in the crucible of war and tempered by loss and love. He strapped on his armor, the familiar weight of the ballistic plates, a comfort against his skin. He checked his weapons, the sleek lines of the pulse rifle, an extension of his own body. And then he was moving, striding out of the safe house and into the neon-lit night, his jaw set and his heart pounding with a single unshakable purpose. He would find Solana, and he would bring her home, no matter the cost. The streets of the city were a blur of light and sound, the hovercars and shuttles weaving through the towering skyscrapers like glowing insects. Jake moved through the crowds like a ghost, his eyes scanning every face, every shadow, for any sign of his enemies. He had no idea where to start looking for Solana, but he knew someone who might. An old contact from his military days, a man with his finger on the pulse of the city's underworld. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had. The meeting was arranged in a dive bar on the outskirts of the town, the kind of place where the drinks were cheap and the patrons were dangerous. Jake slid into a booth at the back, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol as he waited for his contact to arrive. He didn't have to wait long. A figure slid into the seat across from him, a hood pulled low over his face. "Been a long time, Mad Dog," the man said, his voice a rasping whisper. "Thought you'd gone soft, playing house with that pretty little Voltarian." Jake's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. "I need information, Rex. I need to find the people who killed Zoltan and attacked the penthouse. Rex leaned back, his eyes glittering in the dim light. And what makes you think I know anything about that? Because you're a cockroach, Jake said flatly. You survive by knowing everything that happens in this city. And because I'm willing to pay. He slid a credit chip across the table, watching as Rex's fingers closed around it. The man pocketed the chip, then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Word is, there's a new player in town, he said. A real nasty piece of work. Goes by the name of Zorn. He's been making moves on Zoltan's old territory, trying to take over his business interests, and he's got some serious muscle backing him up. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Zorn? He repeated. Who is he? Where can I find him? Rex shook his head. You don't want to mess with this guy, Mad Dog. He's got connections that go all the way to the top, and he's got a real hard-on for your little wifey. Jake's hand tightened on his pistol. What do you mean? I mean he's been looking for her. Word is, she's the key to some kind of Voltarian secret. Something that could make him untouchable. And he's willing to do anything to get his hands on her. Jake's blood ran cold. Solana was in more danger than he'd realized. He had to find her before Zorn did. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Thanks for the info, Rex. I owe you one. The man grinned, his teeth flashing in the darkness. Damn right you do, Mad Dog, and I always collect on my debts. Jake barely heard him. He was already moving, his mind racing as he planned his next move. He had a name now, and a target. All he needed was a location, and he knew just where to start looking. The Voltarian embassy loomed before Jake like a gleaming tower of glass and steel, its spires reaching towards the sky like grasping fingers. He knew that somewhere inside that labyrinthine structure, Solana was fighting for her life, and for his. He approached the entrance, his pulse rifle held at the ready. The guards at the door, a pair of hulking Voltarian males, eyed him warily as he drew near. Halt, one of them barked, his hand resting on the butt of his own weapon. State your business. Jake smiled thinly. I'm here to see Ambassador Zorn, he said, his voice cold as ice. We have some unfinished business to discuss. The guards exchanged a glance. Then the one who had spoken shook his head. The ambassador is not receiving visitors at this time, he said firmly. I must ask you to leave. Jake's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. I wasn't asking, he said softly. He moved faster than the eye could follow. The pulse rifle barked once, twice, and the guards crumpled to the ground, their chests smoking from the point-blank shots. Jake stepped over their bodies, his boots crunching on the shattered glass of the door. Alarms began to blare, a deafening cacophony that echoed through the cavernous lobby. He ignored them, his focus narrowing to a single burning point. He had to find Solana. Nothing else mattered. He moved through the embassy like a wraith, his weapon at the ready, his senses hyper-alert for any sign of danger. He encountered resistance almost immediately, Voltarian guards pouring out of every doorway and corridor, but they were no match for his training, his skill, his sheer unrelenting determination. He cut through them like a scythe through wheat, leaving a trail of broken bodies in his wake. His armor deflected their shots, his own aim true and deadly. He felt a savage joy in the violence, a dark exultation in the knowledge that he was one step closer to his goal. And then, suddenly, he was there, the ambassador's office, a vast opulent chamber that reeked of power and privilege. And there, Standing before the massive desk was Zalana. She was facing off against a tall, imposing Voltarian male, his features cruel and arrogant. Zorn, Jake knew instinctively. The man who had orchestrated all of this, who had torn their lives apart for his own twisted ends. Zalana was speaking, her voice low and urgent. "You don't understand," she was saying. "The key is not a thing. It's a person. It's—" She broke off as Jake stepped into the room, her eyes widening in shock and fear. "Jake," she breathed. "What are you doing here?" He grinned fiercely, his pulse rifle leveled at Zorn's head. "I'm here to finish this," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "Once and for all." Zorn laughed, a cold, mocking sound that set Jake's teeth on edge. "You really think you can stop me, human?" he sneered. "I am more powerful than you can possibly imagine. I have the backing of the entire Voltarian government, the resources of a dozen worlds at my disposal. And you are nothing. A relic of a bygone age, a pathetic remnant of a dying race." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "Maybe so," he said softly. "But I'm the relic who's going to put a hole in your head if you don't let her go." Zorn's eyes narrowed, his hand dropping to the weapon at his side. "You're welcome to try," he hissed, and then all hell broke loose. Zorn moved, his body a blur of speed and power. Jake fired, the pulse rifle bucking in his hands, but the Voltarian was too fast, too strong. He slammed into Jake like a freight train, sending him flying across the room to crash into the far wall. Jake struggled to his feet, his head ringing, his vision blurring. He saw Zalana, her face a mask of terror, as Zorn grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off her feet. "The key," he snarled, his fingers tightening. "Give it to me, or watch your beloved human die." Zalana's eyes met Jake's, a silent plea in their amber depths, and in that moment he understood. The key was not a thing, it was her, Zalana herself, the last living heir to the Voltarian throne, the one person who could unlock the secrets of her people, the power that Zorn so desperately craved, and she would die before she let him have it. Jake felt a calm settle over him, a cold, clear certainty that cut through the pain and the fear. He knew what he had to do. He charged, a wordless cry of rage and defiance tearing from his throat. Zorn turned, his eyes widening in surprise, but it was too late. Jake slammed into him, the force of his impact sending them both tumbling to the ground. They grappled, rolling across the floor in a tangle of limbs and fury. Jake felt Zorn's fingers close around his throat, squeezing with inhuman strength. Black spots danced before his eyes, his lungs screaming for air, but he would not yield. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he wrenched free of Zorn's grip, his hand closing around the hilt of the Voltarian's own knife. He brought it up, the blade flashing in the light, and plunged it into Zorn's chest, again and again and again. The Voltarian convulsed, his eyes bulging in shock and pain. He made a choking, gurgling sound, his blood spurting from the wounds in his chest. And then he was still, his body going limp beneath Jake's own. Jake staggered to his feet, his chest heaving, his body shaking with the aftershocks of battle. He turned, his eyes seeking Zalana. She was there, her face streaked with tears, her eyes shining with a fierce, proud light. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, holding him close. "You came for me," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "You saved me." Jake held her, his own eyes stinging with tears. "I will always come for you," he said softly. "No matter what. I love you, Zalana, more than life itself." She looked up at him, her smile brighter than the sun. "I know," she said simply. "And I love you, Jake McGraw, forever and always." They stood there, holding each other as the world around them faded away. They had won. Against all odds, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. And as they walked out of the embassy, hand in hand, Jake knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, for they were more than just husband and wife, more than just lovers. They were warriors, bound by a love that could never be broken, and together they could face anything the universe could throw at them.